As the 21st century unfolds, China's rise is now obvious for all to see. America's 30-year-long uncontested dominance faces once again real competition. But there is one question that echoes across think tanks and war rooms. Does China want to become the next global hegemon? At first glance, China's economic rise, technological prowess, and assertive diplomacy resemble the script of past great powers, from Rome to Washington. Realist logic puts it simply. The mightier states will attempt to establish hegemony in their own region while making sure no rival dominates another. Though this channel often follows realist logic, geopolitics, however, isn't just international relations theory. When it comes to China, another type of logic needs to be taken under consideration. That is, the Chinese cultural and civilizational lens, and how it's reflective of China's geopolitical realities. In this video, we will explore why China isn't likely to become the next hegemon in the traditional sense. By drawing on historical philosophy and contemporary geopolitics, we will uncover a picture of global leadership that does not seek to dominate, but to attract, absorb, and most of all, to endure. Welcome to The Sovereign Thinker. Please like, share, and subscribe so you too can be a sovereign thinker. Thank you all who have donated, and with that said, let's dive in. In October 2006, the 1,000-foot USS Kitty Hawk aircraft carrier led an American strike group through the East China Sea between Japan and Taiwan. The Kitty Hawk was shielded by a dozen warships, fighter jets flying above, and submarines below. It was a show of America's naval supremacy in East Asia. But then, all of a sudden, the surface broke. A Chinese Song-class attack submarine rose inside the strike group's formation, within torpedo range of the USS Kitty Hawk itself. This was rather shocking. Basically, it was an equivalent of an assassin suddenly appearing at the king's banquet table. The Americans were stunned and furious. Stunned that they hadn't detected the intruder, furious that Beijing had penetrated the strike group's defenses. This was a significant moment because the message was clear. China is no longer confined to the land. It's now staking its claim to the seas. Clashes like this often fuel the view that China wants the top spot, to supplant the US. However, as always, it's never this simple. China's civilization stretches as far back as the world's oldest. Yeah, unlike many that faded into memory, its story remains unbroken. For much of history, China was the leading world power until the rise of Europe and later the United States. But unlike Western empires, China rarely sought expansion through conquest. Instead, it operated under a political and philosophical concept known as Tianxia, meaning all under heaven, which dates back to the Zhou dynasty more than 2,500 years ago. At its core, Tianxia functioned as a tributary system where states voluntarily aligned with China in exchange for the order, trade, and stability it provided. This fostered a form of equilibrium in international relations, creating a balance that often ensured long-term stability. Importantly, neighboring states were not forced to adopt Chinese norms. Rather, many such as Korea and Japan chose to embrace elements of Chinese culture on their own, as opposed to coercion, something that's starkly different from Western empires. Tianxia is not hegemony in the realist sense. It is influence without coercion, meaning a flexible framework where there is a gravitational center with concentric rings of affiliation radiating outwards. In this model, the world is not composed of equal sovereign states in competition, as envisioned by the Westphalian order. Rather, Tianxia puts harmony, not supremacy, as the highest goal. In other words, competition is important, but in the hierarchy of Tianxia, it ranks comparatively lower to harmony. The implications of this philosophy in modern-day international relations are profound. According to Qi Yushi, states, especially those rooted in civilizational culture like China, often act not through coercion but with deliberate self-restraint, preferring to engage in stable, long-term relationships rather than seeking outright dominance. However, for those who remain skeptical of this philosophy, convinced that no system beyond Westphalian competition or outright hegemony is possible, which, by the way, I'd ordinarily agree with, but in China's case, history offers a different lesson. Consider the contrast. China, with thousands of years behind it, has stood as a civilizational powerhouse for much of human history, and yet it has launched relatively few invasions beyond its borders. The United States, on the other hand, rooted in Western Christianity and guided by liberalism or postmodern ideals, has existed for only about 250 years, and in that short span has been at war for more than 230 of them. China's track record doesn't exactly say we seek domination. What's important to highlight, Tianxia aligns with China's geopolitical realities, because as things stand now, China's greatest weakness is not ambition, but vulnerability. Take the Belt and Road Initiative. While often cast as imperial projection, its deeper purpose is hedging against dependence on US-controlled sea lanes. As former Chinese President Hu Jintao warned in 2003, China faced what he called the Malacca Dilemma, the danger that certain major powers could one day seek to control the narrow Strait of Malacca, through which the majority of China's trade passes. A US-led blockade at this choke point could paralyze the Chinese economy. Therefore, the BRI's network of railways, pipelines, and highways across Central Asia, Russia, Europe, and Pakistan is designed to create alternative ports and overland corridors that reduce maritime dependence and on US-controlled choke points. While land routes are not a perfect substitute for oceanic trade, as bulk shipping will always be cheaper and more efficient, but they do, however, reduce strategic risk. And in Beijing's eyes, even partial alternatives are better than nothing. And for this to work, China must maintain harmonious relations with its partners. Dominance would only invite rebellion, and therefore additional vulnerabilities, which is in line with China's Tianxia philosophy of harmony. China's vulnerabilities are not limited to maritime choke points. The United States and its allies dominate what strategists call the first island chain, a chain of islands stretching from Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines, as well as the second island chain further out into the Pacific. In any crisis, these chains could serve as maritime barriers, confining the Chinese Navy and threatening its vital shipping lanes. This was demonstrated in the 1995-96 Taiwan Strait crisis, when the US moved carriers directly through the strait, reminding Beijing how easy the chain could be used against China. As the US Naval War College scholar Andrew S. Erickson explains, barriers is a very Chinese perspective, reflecting a concern that foreign military facilities based on the islands may impede or threaten China's efforts or influence. Western analysts often frame Chinese efforts to push outward, especially into Taiwan, as expansionist, but from Beijing's perspective, this is a defensive necessity. It's not even about Beijing securing the first island chain for themselves, but more so ensuring the US isn't dominating them. How the islands are governed, except of course for Taiwan, is a matter of balance and stability. It is the minimum requirement for ensuring that China and the other countries in the vicinity cannot be strangled at sea, which is a step toward basic security and Tianxia, rather than global conquest. But the most important geopolitical reality for China is its neighborhood. Unlike the United States, who is insulated by oceans and is uncontested in its hemisphere, China rises in a crowded neighborhood. To its north lies Russia. Though a very close partner, China nevertheless has to ensure it remains on good terms with Moscow, because if push comes to shove, Moscow could easily derail China's rise. Therefore, it is very much in China's interest to nurture this relationship. To the southwest, India presents both a demographic rival and a strategic competitor, with border tensions that have bled into confrontation and could easily escalate further. And to the east, Japan and South Korea, who are advanced economies allied to the United States. And to the south, Vietnam and the Philippines, who could always be used as proxies by foreign powers. Add to this the unresolved question of Taiwan, and China faces a geopolitical environment where overreach or dominance could risk encirclement. As Professor John Mearsheimer has noted, America could act like the top dog precisely because it was insulated by geography, but China's circumstances demand far greater delicacy. By virtue of its neighborhood, China is forced to be more cautious, considerate, and diplomatic in its approach to being a rising power. It needs to create harmony not only for itself, but for all its neighbors. Aggressive or hubristic moves would not only alienate key partners, but could also drive its neighbors into an anti-China stance. This structural constraint compels Beijing to pursue influence more subtly through attraction, patience, and collaborated engagement, which, once again, is in line with Tianxia, rather than through overt dominance. Lastly, another aspect one must consider why China isn't likely to pursue traditional hegemony, frankly, is that it's costly. The American experience has shown that the grasp on global dominance comes with a heavy price. We're talking endless military engagements, economic overextension, and the corrosion of domestic society, as well as moral scrutiny. For China, which still faces serious internal challenges, regional imbalances, and a difficult neighborhood, such global ambitions are neither attractive nor sustainable. More importantly, they are far too risky. As the Taoists say, to grasp tightly is to lose. Lasting influence in Tianxia arises not from assertion but from alignment with the deeper order of things. To understand China's place in the 21st century, we must discard outdated paradigms. China does not seek to impose an ideology or construct an empire in the Western mold. It operates from a civilizational vantage point that prioritizes endurance over expansion. Rather than ask whether China wants to become the next hegemon, we should ask whether the age of hegemony itself is ending. In this emerging order, China may not rise to rule the world, but it may become its silent axis. The submarine that surfaced beneath America's fleet in 2006 was not just a message of power, but of perspective. China is rising, yes, but rising in its own way. Hopefully you found this video informative. Thank you for listening to the very end, and of course, ciao for now.